20 relatives froze mid-bite, their eyes locked on me with a pity that felt like a physical weight. "I'm doing this for your own good, Meredith," my brother David said, his voice dripping with the same smug superiority he'd used to drown me out since we were kids. He didn't just arrest me at my grandmother's table. He did it with a smile, finally weaponizing the family's lifelong indifference to prove I was the failure they always assumed I was. As the steel cuffs bit into my wrists, I realized the deepest wound wasn't the metal. It was the silence of my parents, as they watched their miracle son destroy the daughter they never bothered to know. The gravel driveway of my parents' estate in Great Falls, Virginia, crunched under my tires with a sound like breaking bone. It was a crisp November afternoon. The sun hung low and pale in the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the manicured lawns. I sat in my car for a full minute, my hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2. I practiced my breathing, low, rhythmic, controlled. In the world of high-stakes logistics and military intelligence, this was called tactical centering. Here, on the doorstep of the Collins family, it was simply survival. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked exactly as I intended, plain. I wore a charcoal gray blazer and slacks. It was a costume designed to blend into the background of any room, to make me part of the furniture. My mother, Martha, called it unfortunate. I called it camouflage. To the world, I was Meredith Collins, a mid-level consultant for a firm that existed primarily on paper. I was the one who was forgotten at reunions. I was the one who was talked over at dinner. I was the ghost whose birthday was usually marked by a generic card sent 2 days late. I stepped out of the car. The front door of the Victorian house swung open before I even reached the porch. My mother stood there in the frame, silhouetted by the warm, golden light of a chandelier that likely cost more than my first 2 years of salary. She didn't offer a hug. Instead, her eyes raked over me with the clinical precision of a customs inspector. "You're late, Meredith," she said. She didn't wait for an answer. She reached out and tugged at my lapel, her mouth thinning into a hard line of disapproval. "And this fabric, it's so stiff. You look like you're heading to a deposition, not a family Thanksgiving. Would it kill you to wear a little color, something to show you're actually happy to be home?" "It's durable, Mom," I replied. "And I'm happy to be here, truly." The house was a gallery of my brother's life. As I walked through the foyer, I passed the Wall of Fame. There was David in his high school football jersey, David at his police academy graduation, David shaking hands with the mayor after a high-profile drug bust. My presence in the house was limited to a single, small photo in the hallway leading to the guest bathroom, a shot of me at age 12, looking uncomfortable in a sundress, clutching a book on Morse code. In the dining room, the air was thick. It smelled of rosemary-rubbed turkey and the aggressive, metallic aroma of David's expensive cologne. He was already at the head of the table. He was leaning back in his chair with the casual arrogance of a king in his court. He was wearing his deputy sheriff's uniform, the badge polished to a blinding, theatrical sheen. My father, Thomas, sat to his right. His face was animated in a way it never was when he spoke to me. And then, David boomed, his voice filling every corner of the room. My father laughed, slapping the table with a heavy palm. "That's my boy taking charge. That's what this family is about, Meredith. Presence, authority." I took my seat at the far end of the table. I was the negative space in their masterpiece. I noticed the way the silver was laid out, slightly crooked. I noticed the structural crack in the crown molding near the window. I noticed the way the wind shifted the curtains, indicating a seal leak in the window frame. These were the things I was trained to see, the vulnerabilities, the fractures, the things that could bring a structure down if left unchecked. "So Meredith," David said, his eyes locked onto mine with a predatory glint. "Still moving crates around, still doing logistics in that windowless office of yours. It must be hard, sitting in the dark all day while the rest of the world is actually out there doing something. It's quiet work, David, I said, picking up my water glass. But the world doesn't move without it. Spoken like a true bureaucrat, he chuckled. Well, don't worry. If you ever get bored of counting shipping containers, maybe I can get you a job filing papers at the precinct. At least you'd be close to the action. I felt the haptic pulse on my left wrist, a subtle, vibrating code from my watch. My team in DC was checking in. The summit in Brussels was moving into a high-security phase. While my family debated the merits of David's latest traffic stop, I was mentally clearing a flight path for a diplomatic convoy. I was the ghost at the table. I was the silent architect of their safety. For the 1,000th time, I realized that my invisibility was my greatest asset. It was also my deepest wound. I sat there, reaching for a piece of cornbread, while the man who shared my DNA prepared to dismantle the life he was never meant to find. The meal progressed with the practiced rhythm of a play that had been performed too many times. David spoke, our parents listened, and I existed in the margins. Every time I tried to offer a small detail about my life, my mother would pivot the conversation back to David's upcoming commendation or my father's golf handicap. I had become an expert at chewing my food in silence, watching the family dynamic play out like a scripted drama where I was only an extra. But the atmosphere began to shift as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the Great Falls estate into a bruised, purple twilight. The shadows in the corners of the dining room seemed to deepen, and for the first time that day, the air felt thin. I felt it before I saw it, a secondary pulse against my wrist, 2 shorts, 1 long. It was a proximity alert. A localized digital sweep was occurring within a 50-yard radius of the house. Someone was pinging the local network, looking for encrypted signals. My heart rate didn't climb, it leveled out. This was a professional reaction, the kind forged in damp bunkers and secure briefing rooms. I remained Meredith Collins, the boring consultant, but my internal systems were now in a state of high alert. I casually adjusted my blazer, ensuring the sleeve covered the glowing face of my watch. You're doing it again, Mur, David said. His voice cut through my thoughts, sharp and intrusive. He was leaning forward now, his elbows on the table, eyes narrowed. That look, like you're calculating the distance to the nearest exit. You've been home for 2 hours and you've barely said 10 words. What's the matter? Is the logistics business getting stressful, or are you just that bored of your own family? Just a lot on my mind, David, I said. I kept my tone light, almost airy. End of the quarter is always a mess with the shipping lanes. You know how it is. Is that right? David reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He slid a finger across the screen, the light reflecting off his badge. Because I was talking to some of the guys at the station about your firm, Global Supply Solutions. We were curious. We thought we'd send you a little Family of the Year gift to your DC office. A nice plant, maybe. But when we looked up the address on M Street, it's a UPS store, a P.O. box, no office, no lobby, no Meredith. My mother's fork clattered against her china plate. My father's smile faltered, replaced by a sudden, sharp confusion. The air in the room became heavy, pressurized, like the moments before a massive storm breaks. I could feel their eyes on me, not with curiosity, but with a burgeoning suspicion that had been cultivated by David for years. David, I'm sure there's a simple explanation, my mother said, though her voice lacked conviction. I'm sure there is too, David said. His voice dropped into that smooth, dangerous register he used for suspects in the back of his cruiser. But it gets better. I had our tech liaison run a sweep on the signal coming out of this house today. Someone is broadcasting on a high-level military-grade encryption frequency. It's coming from your laptop, Meredith. The one you keep in that locked briefcase under your chair, the one you wouldn't even let Dad help you carry. He leaned in closer. The candlelight made his eyes look like glass. I'm starting to think you aren't a consultant at all. I'm starting to think you're hiding something from us. Something illegal. Maybe you're caught up in something you can't handle. Because a woman with nothing to hide doesn't live her life behind a firewall, Mur. She doesn't have an office that's just a metal box in a strip mall. Before I could respond, my grandmother Evelyn stood up. She had been silent the entire meal, her frail hands resting on the edge of the table. David, that's enough. You're badgering your sister at dinner. Meredith, dear, come help me in the kitchen. I can't lift the heavy pie dishes like I used to, and your mother's back has been bothering her. I followed her into the kitchen. The swinging doors closed behind us, muffling the sudden, heated argument breaking out between David and my father. As soon as we were alone, the frail grandmother disappeared. Evelyn turned to me, her grip on my arm surprisingly firm, her eyes bright with an intelligence she usually kept hidden behind a veil of old-age domesticity. You're being hunted, Meredith, she whispered. Her voice was low and urgent. Grandma, David is just being David. He's obsessed with his own authority, I started, but she shook her head fiercely, silencing me. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, charred scrap of paper. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. It was a fragment of a field report, heavily redacted, with the seal of the U.S. Army Intelligence Command visible at the top. It was a ghost from a mission I had tried to forget. I've been intercepting the junk mail David tried to dig up on you for months, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and awe. He thinks you're a white-collar criminal. I thought you were a mercenary for hire. But I saw the way you looked at the front door when you walked in today. You didn't look for a coat rack, Meredith. You looked for a clear line of sight. You checked the hinges. She pressed the scrap into my hand. The people in that room, they don't know who you are, they don't know the difference between a sheriff and a soldier, but I do. I've lived long enough to know when a woman is carrying the weight of a country. If you don't tell them something soon, David is going to use his badge to tear this family apart, just to prove he's the hero of the story. He's already made calls, Meredith. He's not just guessing anymore. I looked at the charred paper. It was a remnant of my real life. A life I had worked so hard to bury beneath layers of charcoal gray blazers and boring logistics talk. The mystery wasn't just my rank. It was the fact that the two halves of my soul were finally screaming at each other. David was looking for a villain, and Grandma was looking for a savior. Neither of them realized that I was simply a woman trying to keep the world from ending, while I finished my mashed potatoes. I heard the heavy tread of David's boots approaching the kitchen door. The time for silence was over. The collision had begun. The swinging kitchen doors creaked open with a violent snap as David shouldered his way into the room. The air he brought with him was electric. It was charged with the adrenaline of a hunter who believed he had finally cornered his prey. I stood by the counter. The charred fragment of the intelligence report was tucked securely in my palm. My face remained a mask of practiced indifference. I could feel the heat radiating off David, the smug satisfaction of a man about to perform his greatest act. Still hiding in the kitchen, Mur, David's voice was a low, guttural challenge. He didn't look at the pie. He didn't look at the coffee. He looked at me like I was a problem he was finally authorized to solve. Grandma, go back to the table. This doesn't involve you. This is family business, and it's about to get official. Evelyn didn't move. She stood her ground with a quiet, stubborn dignity until I gave her a microscopic nod. She knew the protocol of this house better than anyone. As she retreated, she squeezed my hand, a silent apology for the storm she knew was about to break. She knew she couldn't stop David, but she wanted me to know I wasn't entirely alone. David didn't wait for us to return to our seats. He marched back into the dining room. I followed him. The silence of the house suddenly felt like the pressurized air inside a submarine hull. My parents were sitting in a state of suspended animation. Their eyes darted between us, searching for a script they didn't have. David didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, the lord of the manor returning with the spoils of war. With a flourish that bordered on the theatrical, he slammed a manila folder onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy thud, scattering a few droplets of gravy onto the white lace cloth. I've spent the last 6 months wondering why my sister, the big-shot consultant, was so damn hard to find, David announced. His voice rang with a predatory triumph that made the wine glasses hum. So I did what any good officer does. I ran a deep background query. I used my departmental access. When that hit a wall, a very expensive, very deliberate wall, I hired a specialist. A private investigator who knows how to find people who don't want to be found, people who live in the shadows. He flipped the folder open. Glossy, high-resolution prints slid across the table like playing cards. One by one, they revealed the fragments of my hidden life. My mother gasped. My father reached for his glasses with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Exhibit A, David sneered. He pointed a thick finger at a photo of me in a sun-drenched cafe in Istanbul. I was sitting across from a man with a scarred neck and a Russian watch. You told Mom you were at a logistics seminar in Chicago that week. Istanbul is a long way from the Midwest, Meredith, unless the shipping lanes moved when I wasn't looking. My father, Thomas, pulled the photo closer. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. Meredith, is this true? Were you in Turkey? Exhibit B, David continued. He was relentless now. He was enjoying the harvest. Here you are outside a nondescript warehouse in the Navy Yard. You're handing a secure, lead-lined case to a man in a blacked-out SUV. No company logo, no paper trail. Just you and a man who, according to my pie, has been seen entering the Chinese embassy more than once. I didn't blink, I didn't defend myself. I watched the photos move down the table. I saw my life being dismantled by an amateur who thought he was a genius. David leaned over the table. His face was inches from mine. I could smell the coffee and the arrogance on his breath. You aren't shipping crates, Meredith. You're a bagman. You're an unregistered foreign agent selling logistics, which is just a fancy word for secrets to the highest bidder. You've been using this family's clean name and David Collins's reputation as a shield for treason. You thought I was too stupid to see it. You thought I was just the local cop. David, sit down, I said. My voice was a flat, icy monotone. It was the voice I used when a mission was falling apart and I needed the team to focus. You have no idea what you're looking at. You are dangerously out of your depth. Out of my depth, David laughed. It was a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the room. I'm a sworn officer of the law. I'm looking at a traitor sitting at my mother's Thanksgiving table. I'm looking at the reason this family has felt like it's been living under a cloud for years. Dad, she's been lying to us for 20 years. Every business trip, every late night at the office, it was all a cover for the filth she was peddling. She's been selling us out while we cheered for her imaginary promotions. My mother, Martha, let out a choked, fluttering sob. She looked at the photo of me in Istanbul like it was a picture of a monster. Meredith, please, just say it isn't true. Tell us there's a reason for this. Tell us David is wrong. I looked at her, I looked at my father. I saw the way they instinctively leaned toward David. They wanted him to be right. They wanted the golden boy with the badge to be the one who saved the family from the quiet one who had betrayed them. They didn't want the truth. They wanted the comfort of the narrative they had written for us decades ago. I realized then that the conflict wasn't about the photos. It was about the fact that they had never really wanted to know me at all. The room was suffocating. The scent of the rosemary turkey had turned rancid in my nose, replaced by the metallic, electric tang of fear and betrayal. My father's hand remained flat against the photo from Istanbul, his fingers pressing so hard into the mahogany that his knuckles were bone white. His eyes were filled with a disappointment that was as familiar to me as my own reflection, a deep-seated shame that had finally found a reason to breathe. "Open the laptop, Meredith," my father commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum, delivered with the finality of a judge passing sentence. He pointed a trembling finger at the slim, charcoal-gray briefcase tucked under my chair. "If you're a consultant, show us your files. Show us the shipping manifests. Prove your brother wrong, or so help me, I'll let him take you in. I won't have a criminal under my roof." "I cannot do that, Dad," I said. My voice was quiet, but it held a steel that made the room feel even colder. "That hardware is the property of my employer. Accessing it without authorization is a federal offense. It's not about secrets between us, it's about the law." "Your employer is a ghost," David barked. He was vibrating with a sickening sense of accomplishment. He reached behind his back, his hand moving with a practiced speed, and unclipped a pair of heavy, stainless steel handcuffs from his belt. The ratchet sound, clack clack clack, echoed through the silent room like a death knell. "You've had your chance to play it the easy way, Mur, but I'm not letting a security threat walk out of this house. Not today, not on my watch." David moved with a sudden, predatory aggression. He grabbed my shoulder and forced me to stand, his grip bruising. I didn't resist. In the SEER training I had endured years ago, they taught you that resistance at the wrong moment was a waste of energy. You wait for the window of opportunity. You wait for the enemy to make their fatal mistake. You stay calm while the world burns around you. He yanked my arms behind my back. The cold, unforgiving steel of the cuffs bit into the skin of my wrists, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the dining room. My mother let out a small, broken sound, but she didn't move to stop him. Neither did my father. They just watched, their faces masks of grim approval. As the locks clicked into place with that final metallic notch, the haptic sensor on my tactical watch, pressed firmly against the pulse point of my wrist beneath the sleeve of my blazer, detected the sudden constriction and the sharp spike in my cortisol levels. I felt the watch pulse once, a long, deep vibration that only I could feel. The silent distress beacon had been activated. The clock was now ticking in a windowless room 300 miles away. "There," David said. He sounded breathless, intoxicated by the rush of his own authority. "How does it feel, Mur, to finally be on the other side of the law?" "Mom, Dad, I'm taking her down to the precinct for a formal interrogation. I'll run her prints through the federal database myself. We'll see how long your logistics story holds up under a desk lamp." "Wait," I said. I turned my head just enough to look him in the eye. My gaze was no longer that of his disappointing sister. My eyes were the eyes of a woman who had directed drone strikes from a bunker in the desert, a woman who had survived things he couldn't even imagine. "David, listen to me very carefully. The moment you used your police credentials to run an unauthorized query on my firm, you tripped a red flag alert at the Department of Defense. You think you're being a hero, but you're just a loose thread." He scoffed, tightening his grip on my arm until it hurt. "Still with the spy fantasies. It's over, Meredith. You're just a girl in a cheap suit who got caught playing a game that was too big for her." "Look at the clock, David," I said. My voice dropped to a whisper, a low, lethal sound that made the hair on the back of my mother's neck stand up. "You have exactly 5 minutes before your life, your career, and this entire house become a secondary concern to the United States Army. You didn't just arrest your sister, you just kidnapped a general. And the people coming to get me don't care about your badge." He didn't listen, he couldn't. He was too busy basking in the light of his own performance. He began to lead me toward the foyer, his chest puffed out, a hero in his own mind. My parents followed like mourners at a funeral, their faces masks of grief and shame. They didn't see the blacked-out SUVs already turning onto our quiet, suburban street. They didn't see the red dots of the sniper's lasers dancing across the Victorian siding of the house. They only saw the daughter who had finally failed them, completely unaware that the world they knew, the hierarchy they had built their lives on, was about to be dismantled piece by piece. My brother was dragging me toward the door, but he was the one walking into a trap. The hallway of my parents' home felt like a tunnel, narrow and suffocating. David's hand was like a vice on my upper arm. He was forcing me toward the front door, his knuckles white against the dark fabric of my blazer. The shame in the house was a physical weight now. It was thick enough to taste, a mixture of stale rosemary and the bitter tang of betrayal. My mother followed at a distance, her hands pressed tightly to her face as if to hold herself together. My father walked with his head bowed. He stared at the floorboards, avoiding the wall of fame photos of David that seemed to watch our procession like a silent, judgmental jury. Every step David took was heavy with a predatory triumph. He was the hero of the hour, and I was the trophy he was taking to the station. "Open the door, Dad," David barked. His voice was vibrating with a frantic, jagged energy. He was riding the high of the collar. "I want her out of this house before the neighbors see more than they have to. We're doing this by the book." My father reached for the brass handle, his fingers shaking, but he never actually touched it. The sound wasn't an explosion. It was a rhythmic, mechanical percussion that started as a low hum and quickly escalated into a bone-rattling roar. It was the thrum-thrum-thrum of low-altitude rotors. The sound was so powerful it rattled the china in the dining room cabinets and made the century-old floorboards groan beneath our feet. Then, the world outside the foyer turned a blinding, sterile white as high-intensity searchlights flooded through the sidelight windows. The front door didn't just open. A precision breach charge took it off its hinges, with a dull, pressurized thud that sucked the air out of the room. The wood didn't fly inward. It was simply removed, the heavy oak splintering into 1,000 tiny teeth. Before the dust could even settle on the Persian rug, 6 figures in matte black tactical gear flooded into the foyer. They moved with a predatory, silent grace. Their suppressed rifles swept the room with the mechanical efficiency of a clockwork machine. Laser dots, red and lethal, danced across the floral wallpaper and settled on David's chest. David reacted with the panicked instinct of a small-town cop caught in a big city nightmare. He didn't think, he didn't assess. He reached for his service weapon, his fingers fumbling at the retention strap of his holster. "Weapon down, drop it now." The voice didn't scream. It didn't need to. It commanded with the absolute weight of a mountain. Colonel Marcus Thorne stepped through the ruin of the doorway. He was a man of iron and shadow. His dress blues appeared almost black in the flickering, strobe-like light of the damaged chandelier. He didn't look at the house. He didn't look at my terrified parents, who were now huddled against the staircase. His eyes locked onto David's hand. "Officer," Thorne said. His voice was a low, lethal vibration that cut through the noise of the hovering aircraft outside. "If that thumb touches the retention strap, my team is cleared to neutralize the threat to this asset. You are currently aiming a weapon at a Tier 1 federal officer. Lower it. Now, this is your only warning." David's face went from a flush of triumph to a deathly, ashen gray. His hand froze, then trembled, and slowly fell away from his belt. He looked like a child caught playing with fire. The Tier 1 operators moved in, their muzzles never wavering, their eyes invisible behind night vision glass. Thorne walked past my brother as if he were a piece of discarded furniture. He stopped inches from me. He didn't look at the handcuffs with pity. He looked at them with a cold, professional fury that made my brother shrink back against the wall. Thorne snapped his heels together. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent foyer. He brought his hand to his brow in a sharp, crisp salute that held more power than any badge David had ever worn. "Brigadier General Meredith Collins," Thorne said, his voice ringing with a clarity that finally broke the silence of the Collins house. "We have a code red extraction protocol in effect. Your domestic cover has been compromised by an unauthorized background query and a reckless, illegal breach of security. We are here to secure you and the classified assets in your possession." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens after a bomb goes off. My mother's breath hitched in a ragged, broken sob. My father gripped the banister so hard I thought the wood would snap. David stood frozen against the wall, his mouth hanging open. His badge, the thing he had used to terrorize me just minutes ago, appeared small and toy-like against the backdrop of the men who actually held the world together. The hierarchy of the family had been decimated in a matter of seconds. Thorne turned to the operator nearest him, his eyes never leaving mine. "Unshackle the general, then detain the intruder for federal questioning. He's compromised a national security interest." The operator stepped forward, the key clicking into the locks David had so proudly snapped shut. I didn't look at the soldier, I looked at David. I wanted him to see the ghost he had tried to arrest. I wanted him to see the person he had ignored for 20 years. As the metal fell away, I realized the house was finally, truly quiet. The architecture of my silence had been replaced by the weight of my command. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a general, and my extraction had only just begun. The metal cuffs fell to the hardwood floor with a hollow, ringing sound that felt like the closing of a heavy iron door. I rubbed my wrists, the skin red and raw where the steel had bitten deep, but my eyes never left my brother. David was no longer the hero of his own story. He was a man being pinned against the floral wallpaper of his childhood home by soldiers who didn't recognize his badge, his authority, or his excuses. The Tier 1 operators held him with a clinical, terrifying efficiency, their gear clinking softly as they secured his hands with heavy-duty zip ties. I didn't know," David stammered. His voice was a high, thin reed, a desperate sound that lacked any of the thunder he'd used at the dinner table. "The pie," he said she was meeting with foreign agents. He showed me the photos. I was protecting the family name. I was doing my job. "Dad, tell them I'm a deputy sheriff." Colonel Thorne turned to him. His expression wasn't one of anger. It was pure, unadulterated disgust. It was the look a professional gives a reckless amateur who has just burned down the house to kill a spider. "Your job was to follow protocol, officer," Thorne said. His voice was like a grindstone. "Instead, you used a departmental login to query a protected federal identity. You sent a civilian investigator to tail a general during a multi-agency summit. You didn't protect your family, David. You just burned a 3-year operation and exposed a high-level asset to every signal intelligence agency on the planet. You've compromised the very flag you claim to serve." Thorne looked at me, waiting for my command. The power in the room had shifted so violently that the air felt thin. I walked over to the dining table. I picked up the charcoal gray briefcase David had tried to seize, the weight of it familiar and grounding. I looked at my parents. Martha was staring at me as if I were a stranger, a dangerous ghost that had taken the place of her daughter. Thomas looked at his feet, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, unable to meet the gaze of the child he had treated like a footnote for 38 years. "You all wanted me to be small," I said. My voice was quiet, but it filled the foyer, cutting through the distant whine of the extraction helicopters. "You needed me to be the disappointment so that David could be the star. It was a comfortable arrangement, wasn't it? The golden boy and the quiet girl who did nothing." I looked at my mother, whose eyes were wide with a terror that wasn't for me, but for the collapse of her world. You were so blinded by the spotlight you put him in that you never once wondered why I was so quiet. You never asked about my life, because you were afraid it might actually be more significant than the one you imagined for me. Meredith, please, my father whispered. He looked up then, his face ash-gray. We're your family, we didn't mean, we just thought. Family is built on respect, Dad, not just on who speaks the loudest or who wears the shinier badge, I replied. I turned my back on them and looked at Thorne. My professional mask was fully in place now. Colonel, the officer used his authority to weaponize a personal vendetta. He compromised a federal identity and endangered a classified mission. Process him according to Title 18, no special treatment, no family favors. This isn't a dinner table argument anymore. It's a matter of national security. David's face crumpled. The realization finally hit him that the golden boy wasn't going to be saved this time. As the soldiers began to lead him out, his head hanging, his swagger replaced by a stumbling, broken gait, I saw the Wall of Fame one last time. The glass on David's high school football photo had cracked during the breach, a jagged line running right through his smiling face. I didn't stay to watch them process the scene. I didn't stay to hear my mother's apologies or my father's explanations. I walked out of the Victorian house, past the ceramic frog on the porch, and into the cold night air. The searchlights were still sweeping the lawn, turning the suburbs into a war zone. I climbed into the back of the black SUV, the door closing with a heavy, pressurized seal that shut out the sound of my old life. I was Meredith Collins, and the ghost was finally gone. I was a general, and the world I was heading toward was much larger and much colder than the one I was leaving behind. I watched through the tinted glass as the house shrank in the distance, a small, lit box filled with people who had never truly seen me at all. The silence of my quarters at Fort Hawthorne was a different kind of quiet than the one I had grown up with. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of being ignored. It was a silence that felt earned. It was absolute. I sat on the edge of my cot, the moonlight through the narrow window silvering the training fields outside. I was still in uniform. The ribbons on my chest felt like an armored weight I couldn't yet bring myself to remove. I hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night since the dinner. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shattered glass of my brother's football photo. I saw the look of utter incomprehension on my father's face. Then the phone on my bedside table vibrated. It wasn't my encrypted military line. It was my personal cell, the one with the unlisted number. I stared at the screen, Grandma. My thumb hovered over the icon for a long time. I almost didn't pick up. I wasn't sure I could handle another apology or another reminder of the wreckage I had left in Great Falls. But I answered. Hello, I said. My voice sounded thin in the empty room. Meredith, she said. Her voice was softer than usual, more fragile, yet it held a clarity that cut through the miles between us. They took David's badge yesterday, honey. The Internal Affairs office sent 2 men in suits. Your father, he hasn't left his study in weeks. He just sits there staring at the mahogany. The house feels like a tomb. I didn't want it to end this way, Grandma, I said. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the distant perimeter lights flicker. I didn't want to be the one to dismantle his life, but he made a choice. He used his badge as a weapon for his own ego. He compromised a federal asset. I couldn't just walk away from that. I know, she whispered. I could hear the faint sound of her breathing on the other end. But I didn't call to talk about him. I didn't call to talk about the mess he made. I called to say what I should have said 20 years ago. I saw you, Meredith. I saw you when you were 10 years old, spread out on the kitchen floor, mapping the Battle of Gettysburg while the other kids were screaming in the yard. I saw the fire in you. I saw that quiet intensity, and I knew it was something special. And I let them tell you to be quiet. I let your mother tell you to stay in the shadows, because I thought it would make your life easier. I thought it would protect you from their expectations. I was wrong, I was a coward. The words hit me with a force greater than any tactical breach I had ever led. I had spent decades telling myself I didn't need their validation. I told myself the rank on my shoulder was enough. I told myself that the mission was my family. But hearing the truth from the one person who had actually looked at me, really looked at me, shattered the last of the ice around my heart. I felt a hot, sudden pressure behind my eyes. "You don't owe me an apology, Grandma," I said, my voice thick. "I do," she insisted. "Because you didn't just survive this family, Meredith, you became the best of us. You are the only one who truly understands that honor isn't something you wear on a sleeve for show. It's something you carry in the dark. It's the weight you lift when no one is watching. I am so proud of you. Not because you're a general, but because you stayed true to that little girl with the maps." After we hung up, the tears finally came. They weren't for the brother I had lost, or the parents who didn't know me. I cried for the girl who had sat at the edge of the dinner table for 18 years, making herself small, waiting for someone to notice she was brave. I cried for the ghost I had been. I realized then that healing wasn't about my parents finally understanding my world. It was about me finally forgiving them for being too small to see it. I stood up and walked to my desk. I pulled out a blank sheet of stationery. My hands were steady now. The haptic pulse on my watch was quiet. I was done hiding, but I was also done hoping for them to change. I wrote the words I needed to say, not for their sake, but for mine. I was Meredith Collins, and I had finally realized that being seen by the world didn't matter as much as finally seeing myself. The quiet wasn't a prison anymore. It was a sanctuary. I looked out at the dark fields of the academy, knowing that tomorrow I would start building a legacy that wasn't based on spotlights, but on the strength that only the silent ones truly understand. The morning air at Fort Hawthorne was sharp, carrying the scent of damp pine and the metallic, electric hum of a bass waking up. I stood on the edge of the training fields, watching the new batch of recruits scale the walls. They were exhausted, they were covered in mud. Their lungs were on fire, and their hearts were still learning how to carry the dual burden of pride and fear. I watched them for a long time, my arms folded across my chest. I remembered what it was like to be unseen. I remembered the grit it took to climb without anyone noticing, and to earn every inch of progress in absolute silence. The offer for the 4th star had come wrapped in heavy ceremony just 2 days ago. It was delivered by a 3-star general with a firm handshake, a sealed envelope, and a speech about unparalleled service and strategic brilliance. The words had echoed in the marble hallways of the Pentagon like a formal blessing. The next step was laid out for me: a bigger office, a more prestigious title, and a seat at the highest tables of power. But I didn't open the envelope. I took the long route back to my quarters instead. I passed through these grounds because I realized that my legacy wasn't going to be a building with my name on it or a plaque on a wall in D.C. It was going to be found here, in the dirt and the grit. Later that night, I sat at my desk and looked at the envelope. I placed it in the top drawer, still sealed, and made my decision. When the Defense Secretary's office called to congratulate me, I thanked them for the nomination, and then I declined. They were stunned. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "May we ask why, General?" the aide had asked, his voice a mixture of confusion and forced respect. Because I know where I'm needed, I replied. I didn't need a bigger title, I needed a longer impact. I was reassigned to instructor duty at Fort Hawthorne within the week. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't public, but it was foundational. Every day now, I walk the field with cadets who are nervous, cocky, or barely holding it together. In all of them, I see versions of who I used to be, uncertain, quiet, and far too easy for the world to overlook. Those are the ones I focus on. I pull them aside after the grueling drills. I ask about their stories. I give them silence without the pressure to perform and praise, without pretense. I teach them discipline without the need for humiliation. Slowly, I see them begin to rise. They don't get louder, they get stronger. One evening, after the lights were out and the bass had settled into a quiet hum, I sat in my office and pulled out a blank sheet of stationery. It was cream-colored, the kind that smelled faintly of paper, memories, and lavender. I thought of the looping cursive I hadn't seen in years. Dear Grandma, I wrote. You told me to live, so I am. Not on a podium, and not in front of cameras, but here. On muddy fields. Beside trembling hands. I'm here for the first spark of belief, when someone realizes they're capable of more than the world expected. I paused, my pen hovering over the paper. I didn't take the promotion, not because I wasn't proud, but because I knew the mission I'm called to doesn't require another star. It requires presence. It requires the kind of listening you taught me when I was 8, and you sat through my 50-minute speech on NATO logistics like it was a bedtime story. They don't talk about us, the quiet ones in the family stories. But I've learned something important. Silence can still echo if what we build is strong enough to carry the weight. I hope I'm building well. With all my heart, Meredith. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. I wrote her name in a script that mirrored her own. For the first time in my 38 years, I wasn't writing to explain my existence or to justify my choices. I was writing to share a life that was finally mine. I walked to the window and looked out at the Wall of Honor in the distance. A new plaque had been mounted there, brushed steel against the dark granite. It read, Wall of Honor, Unspoken Service. Below it, my name was etched in a precise serif font. No speeches, no cameras. Just a name on a wall where only a few would look, and even fewer would truly understand. It was enough, it was more than enough. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was a foundation. As I stood there, alone but never again lonely, I let a small smile break across my face. I was building something that would last long after the noise of the world faded away. The secure briefing room at the Regional Federal Annex was a vacuum of light and sound. It was windowless, sterile, and entirely indifferent to the history between the two people sitting inside. I sat on one side of the thick ballistic glass. My brother David sat on the other. This wasn't the Victorian dining room with its warm chandeliers and rosemary-scented air. This was a place of steel and fluorescent humming. David was no longer wearing his crisp sheriff's uniform or the polished badge he had treated like a holy relic. He wore a standard-issue gray jumpsuit that seemed to swallow his frame, making his shoulders look narrow and his posture stooped. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, a man stripped of the costumes that gave him his sense of self. The Internal Affairs report came back this morning, David, I said. My voice was filtered through the intercom, sounding flat and detached, like a weather report or a recorded sentence. You didn't just violate departmental policy. You accessed a federal database using a secondary bypass you weren't authorized to touch. You put a private investigator on a Tier 1 asset during an active security window. The Department of Justice isn't looking for a settlement, they're looking for a conviction. They want to make an example of the man who compromised a general's cover for a personal grudge. David's hands were spread flat on the metal table between us. They were trembling, a constant, fine vibration that he couldn't suppress. He wouldn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the bolt heads in the table, as if he were trying to count them. "I thought I was doing the right thing, Mur," he whispered. His voice was a thin, dry sound that barely carried through the speaker. "I thought, if I could prove you were lying, I could save the family from whatever trouble you were bringing home. I was trying to be the hero. Isn't that what we were taught? Isn't that what Dad expected? To be the one who takes charge and fixes the problem?" I leaned forward. My shadow fell over him, darkening the table. "You weren't trying to save the family, David. You were trying to save your ego. You couldn't stand that I had a life you couldn't control or even understand. You wanted me to be a criminal because a criminal is still less than a deputy sheriff. You could handle a sister who was a failure, but you couldn't survive a sister who was a general. A general makes you irrelevant. It makes your spotlight look like a flashlight with dying batteries. That was the one thing you couldn't handle." The silence that followed was heavy. It was thick with the weight of 20 years of sibling rivalry and the unspoken resentments that had finally reached their logical conclusion. David finally looked up. His eyes were glassy, rimmed with a red fatigue that spoke of sleepless nights in a holding cell. "Mom and Dad, they won't even talk to me," he said, his voice breaking. "They say I've embarrassed the name. They say I've ruined everything. Dad won't even take my calls from the facility. They are mourning a version of you that never existed, David," I said firmly. I felt a flicker of pity, but it was buried under decades of professional discipline. And they are finally meeting a version of me they spent a lifetime ignoring. This is the fallout. This is the cost of hubris. You used the law as a stage for your own personal drama, and now the curtain has fallen. You fired the shot, and now you have to live in the impact zone. I stood up to leave. I didn't offer him a lawyer. I didn't offer him a way out. I didn't even offer him the comfort of a lie. I was Meredith Collins, and I understood that the world David had built was made of glass and spotlights. Mine was made of granite and silence. As I walked toward the heavy steel door, I heard him call my name, a small, desperate sound that didn't follow me out. I walked through the annex, my boots hitting the linoleum with a steady, purposeful rhythm. My mind was already pivoting. David was a closed file, a mission that had reached its end. I was heading back to Fort Hawthorne, back to the training fields where the air was clean, and the hierarchies were based on something more substantial than a dinner table narrative. I was moving away from the wreckage of the Collins family and toward the first real peace I had known in my adult life. The road ahead was quiet, and for the first time, that was exactly what I wanted. I was a general without a ghost, and the silence was finally mine to command. The air at Fort Hawthorne was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the sharp, metallic tang of the morning's firing range practice. I stood in the doorway of my new office, watching the sunrise hit the wall of honor in the courtyard. My life had shifted from the shifting shadows of international operations to the clarity of education. The high-stakes adrenaline of the Pentagon had been replaced by the steady, meaningful hum of the academy. It was a trade I would make 1,000 times over. I sat at my desk and pulled a single sheet of cream-colored stationery from the drawer. It was heavy, textured paper, the kind that demanded a certain level of honesty. This was the letter I had written 12 times in my head since the night of the extraction, but only now did the words feel balanced. Only now did they feel final. "Dear Mom and Dad," I wrote, my pen moving with a precision that felt like a release of 20 years of tension. "I am not coming home for the holidays this year. I am not doing this to punish you, but to protect the person I have finally become. For 20 years, I was the silence in your house. I was the ghost you lived with, the disappointment you tolerated while you basked in David's light. I am now the voice in a much larger room. I hope one day you can see the difference between a daughter who follows a script and a leader who serves a purpose. Until then, I wish you peace. I sealed the envelope with a firm press of my thumb. The golden boy myth was dead, buried under the weight of federal transcripts and a gray jumpsuit. The invisible daughter had been replaced by a woman of substance, a woman who no longer needed to hide behind a consultant's mask to feel safe. I dropped the letter into the outgoing mail bin, and for the first time, the weight of the Collins name didn't feel like a stone around my neck. The final act of my day was a lecture to the graduating class. I stood before them in the large, tiered auditorium, not as a symbol of distant power, but as a testament to resilience. 200 pairs of eyes watched me, some eager for glory, others just trying to survive the week. Among them, I saw the same patterns I had seen my entire life: the loud ones, the cocky ones, and the ones who sat in the back, watching the world with predatory intelligence. Many of you will leave here and seek the spotlight, I told the silent room. My voice was low, but carried to the very last row without effort. You will want the medals, you will want the accolades, you will want the world to know your name. And for some of you, that ambition will lead you to greatness. But remember this: the greatest service is often the most invisible. True strength is found in the things you do when no one is watching. I paced the stage, my boots hitting the boards with a steady, rhythmic cadence. I looked at them, really looked at them. Respect the person who says the least, I continued. For they are often the ones carrying the most weight. Do not mistake silence for weakness. Do not mistake a lack of ego for a lack of ambition. And never, ever underestimate the person who is content to let you take the credit while they do the work. Because when the lights go out and the noise fades, they are the ones who will still be standing. As the cadets stood to salute, the sound of 200 heels hitting the floor at once was like a thunderclap. I saw the girl from the third row, the one who had reminded me so much of the girl I used to be. She stood a little straighter today. She wasn't looking around for approval from her peers. She wasn't looking for a spotlight. She was looking at the map on the screen behind me, her mind already 3 steps ahead of the current exercise. She saw me, and for the first time, I felt like she understood exactly what I was offering her. I walked out of the auditorium and into the bright Virginia morning. The weight of the secret was gone. The burden of my family's narrow expectations had been lifted. I walked toward the training fields, the sun finally rising high and undeniable over the horizon. My name is Meredith Collins. I am a sister, a daughter, and a brigadier general. But more importantly, I am a teacher. I finally understood that true victory wasn't about being seen by the people who didn't matter. It was about being known by the people who did. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was the light. The true measure of a person is rarely found in the noise they make or the space they occupy in a room. We live in a world that often mistakes volume for authority and visibility for value, yet some of the most profound forces in our lives are entirely silent. Respect is not a commodity to be demanded through titles or inherited status. It is a resonance earned through the quiet consistency of one's character. When we look down on the quiet ones, the observers, or those who seem content in the shadows, we often miss the steel that holds the structure together. We forget that the deepest rivers run with the least sound, and the foundations of our society are built by those who do not require a spotlight to do what is right. This journey reminds us that every individual carries a hidden world, a map of sacrifices, victories, and scars that the naked eye can never fully perceive. To judge someone based on the narrative we have written for them is not just a failure of insight, it is an act of injustice. True wisdom lies in the humility to recognize that we are surrounded by quiet generals, people who carry the weight of their responsibilities with grace, requiring no applause to maintain their integrity. The philosophy of a well-lived life is not found in the height of the pedestal we build for ourselves, but in the strength of the service we provide to others when no one is watching. In the end, the light that shines the brightest is the one that illuminates the path for others, rather than the one that seeks to blind them. Thank you for joining me for this journey through the layers of silence and strength. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of the quiet generals in your own life, please share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following and subscribing to the channel to stay updated on future stories. Your support helps me continue to bring these voices to life. Until next time, remember that your value is never defined by how much the world sees, but by the integrity of what you build in the quiet.